and welcome to the program. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Liz Brailsford, the new president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. I've spent my first few weeks at the council learning about the ins and outs, but also getting to know the staff better. And I'm incredibly excited about all the things that we will accomplish together. And I'm also greatly looking forward to meeting all of you when it's safe to do so. Our program tonight features award-winning author David Michaelis, moderated by historian and lawyer Talmadge Boston, to discuss David's new book, Eleanor, an eye-opening portrait of an often misunderstood First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Please remember to purchase a copy of the book, and you can do so with our partners at Interrobang Books. All of our audience receives a 10% discount in the online store by using the code dfwworld. And remember, the discount code is good for any of the books in your shopping cart, not just Eleanor. We have a full schedule of virtual programs, so remember to check out our website at dfwworld for newly scheduled events. And tomorrow evening on Wednesday the 3rd at 6 p.m. Central, we'll welcome Joby Warwick, national security reporter at the Washington Post and Pulitzer Prize winner for journalism, to discuss his new book, Red Line: The Unraveling of Syria and America's Race to Destroy the Most Dangerous Arsenal in the World. He'll be in conversation with our very own Jim Falk. And the council is incredibly grateful for all of its supporters. Tonight, I'd especially like to thank Briggs Freeman Sotheby's International Realty and its president and CEO, Robbie Briggs. Robbie, thank you for your sponsorship of this program, which increases global awareness right here in Dallas. Robbie, thank you very much. And with that, I hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Liz. And by the way, welcome to Dallas. And we're very excited to get to know you as well. Tonight, it really is my pleasure to first introduce Talmadge Boston, who may not need much of an introduction here in Dallas. As everyone knows, he's a very fine litigator here in Dallas, working for Shackelford, Bowen, McKinley, and Norton, LLP. But he's also a good friend. And if you've not had the opportunity before to hear him moderate a panel like this, you're in for a real treat. He's intelligent, he's inquisitive, and he comes up with great questions. And it's also my pleasure because David Michaelis is our friend and neighbor up in Maine. And so I put the two of them together because I knew it would be a great event, and I'm thrilled to be a part of it tonight. One last thing about Talmadge, he also is an author. He's written several books, including Raising the Bar, The Crucial Role of a Lawyer in Society, Cross-Examining History, a lawyer gets answers from the experts about our presidents, and then he's written 3 about his passion, which is baseball. Talmadge, thank you very much for taking the time to interview David, and I look forward to hearing y'all's conversation.
Thank you, Robbie, and thank you for introducing me to David and his wonderful new book, Eleanor, which I hope everybody after this program, if you haven't already, will get it. It's just a dazzling read. David is a very accomplished historian. This is his 3rd major biography. The first was of N.C. Wyeth, the great illustrator who was the father of Andrew Wyeth. The second one was on Charles Schulz, the creator of the Peanuts cartoon strip. And then this is the 3rd. They've all been critically acclaimed, and have the one on Wyeth won a major national award. So David, we're so glad that you could fit Dallas-Fort Worth into your schedule, and welcome to our largely Texas viewing audience.
I'm so glad to be here. Glad to see the lights are on and everyone's well, and very glad to have Robbie's sponsorship and friendship and yours, Talmadge. I've been reading your wonderful book of interviews of some of the great historians of our age. And well, I think the separated at birth with you and Teddy Roosevelt has now haunted me, and that's where I'm gonna be looking into the eyes of TR tonight. I feel I'm ready.
Yeah, I had a friend who last week pointed out that if I had a really bushy mustache and pince-nez glasses, I would look exactly like Teddy Roosevelt. So maybe that's true. But in any case, let's get started talking about your wonderful book here. And whenever I open a book, I always pay a lot of attention to the epigraph, which is the opening sentence or two. And obviously a lot of thought goes into it, David, because it's often a key that really unlocks the book. And so for your epigraph, you actually chose a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt herself, who once said, quote, "I felt obliged to notice everything." Now, David, wax eloquent on why that sentence opens the door to Eleanor Roosevelt for the reader.
Well, Eleanor had two superpowers, and one of them was noticing, one of them was seeing, and she connected as a human, as a woman, as a friend, even as a parent where she was not as successful, but most especially as a first lady and as a stateswoman, by seeing into people and seeing their lives as individuals. Every cause, every theme, every important political and a humanitarian initiative of her life began, as she often said, by seeing the plight of one person. And I think really the theme of Eleanor is the theme of the individual in a democracy, the individual in the world. And she was the person who went between the individual and the community and the government and the world. And she was a understander, a observer, but most especially a real noticer of people. And that's why I chose that. I think also it's really important to know that she saw her husband and saw the important people in her life in a way that you don't see in other biographies. You don't see in biographies of FDR. You have to see it from her point of view. And I wanted the reader to start this book understanding that they were going to be seeing the world from Eleanor's point of view.
Mm-hmm. Now, to fully grasp any biographical subject, I think it really is essential to understand their childhood. And so during Eleanor Roosevelt's childhood, she had what could accurately be called the parents from hell. So her mother was cold and cruel. Her name was Anna. Her father was irresponsible and ultimately suicidal. His name was Elliot. He was Theodore Roosevelt's brother. And she described her childhood later as one long battle against fear. So talk about what you believe to be the effect of this terrible childhood on her ultimate development.
She wanted, as she always said, to be loved so badly as a child, and wanted so badly to be loved by her father, most of all. You mentioned her mother and how cold her mother was. Her father's love for her was authentic and real and warm, and he cared deeply that she would be a writer, that she would be a Roosevelt, that she would be a woman who would be able to sit tall in the saddle and command the world. But he wasn't there for her. And ultimately his life, his attempts at overcoming alcoholism, which left him finally an addict of laudanum, his attempts at recovery were exhausted by his early 30s. And he could not be the father that he wanted to be for Eleanor and that she wanted. Her constant longing, I think, created this lifelong sense that she was unloved, that she could fulfill herself by loving other people, by helping them, by doing something for them. She was, for her father, a sort of super daughter. She was wife, daughter, caretaker, all wrapped up in one. And as she saw him once taken out of the house with yet another broken limb from, in this case, a society circus, where he was going to have his broken leg reset, when she saw the pain he was in and saw that his entire life was actually on the verge of collapse, she became as a true empath and true daughter of an alcoholic does, she became a family hero. She dedicated herself to being a heroic woman on behalf of her father, and that carried through her whole life, of course.
Mm-hmm. Now, she became an orphan before she reached age 10. And then she lived with her maternal grandmother for the next 4 years in a brownstone with a steady string of nannies who were actually taking care of her. And in your book, you say she was plagued by anxieties with the terror of displeasing the people she lived with, and she had no one to love her. So, David, play amateur psychologist. How did her tough entry and journey through puberty impact her long-term mental health?
I think she was the family hero. Certainly, that is the classic child of the alcoholic. But she was also she was an adapter, and I think it was the beginning of seeing Eleanor Roosevelt's life of adaptation, because she was thrown in as an orphan with a family that was filled with glamorous but completely ineffective aunts and uncles who were 5, 10, 15 years older than she was. They were a coming down from the heights of New York society of a generation early. The Hall family was falling behind the Vanderbilts and the Whitneys and Mrs. Astor's ballroom as it expanded from 400 to 1400. And her mother desperately had tried to become a social leader. But after her mother's death from diphtheria, and Eleanor lived with her grandmother, and aunts and uncles, she became their caretaker. She became the one who was the sort of mature, responsible member of the household who would bail out an uncle when he was thrown into jail in the Tenderloin district in New York. She was fascinated by her aunts, but she was also ready to take on all the sort of wreckage of their love life and their breakdowns and their sudden, sort of a constant psychodrama in the Hall household that Eleanor found her way through and became a survivor, became an adapter, became someone who knew how to bail someone out of jail, and someone who knew how to take responsibility far beyond her years, even for burying someone, even for seeing someone, into the grave.
Now, right before she turned age 15, she left all that, the grandmother, the nannies, the drama of that brownstone, and went to a French boarding school outside of Paris. And there she encountered the headmistress, Marie Souvestre, who was a lesbian, but who certainly had a huge mentoring impact on Eleanor over the next 4 years. And you say in the book that Ms. Souvestre helped Eleanor find her voice and lose her fears. So what was going on there? How did this headmistress have that kind of impact on her young student?
Really, by empowering her to trust herself in ways that no one had ever trusted Eleanor to trust herself. In one sense, she came into a school. This is outside of London. A group of international schoolgirls from privileged families around Europe. Eleanor was alone among a group of women young girls who really did not know more than she did, and she actually could speak French fluently at that point because she had a French governess. She had that advantage. But Marie Souvestre saw her and saw that she was going to be the one among the schoolgirls of Allenswood School who was going to be the more responsible, more grown-up one, the one who could do the things that Marie Souvestre wanted young women to do, which was to think for herself. And that was her great lesson, was think for yourself, form your own opinions, use your mind. And this was a time where young women's education was thought of as potentially harmful to their mental health. So there was a sudden sense for Eleanor that she was in a place that she could blossom. She had confidence being being herself. She could sit opposite Marie Souvestre and whoever Marie Souvestre's guest was from, whether it was G.B. Shaw or one of the Strachey's. She could follow along with adults and carry her own in a conversation and begin to suddenly express ideas, something she'd never been actually even thought to do before, that she had thought to do before and was never expected of her. Suddenly, it was expected that she become a sort of a young intermediary a statesman going in between the young girls from other countries and Marie Souvestre she was a kind of dictatorial head mistress, and Eleanor found ways of subtleties and nuance of diplomacy. And she had one great friend who came from Texas, Nellie Post, from a big family, one of the largest ranches in Texas. She was kind of a rebel, and Eleanor defended her when Nellie Post threw an inkwell, at their German teacher, and Marie Souvestre took her case under consideration. Eleanor argued for her that she should stay, she should be forgiven, and Nellie Post was thrown out forthwith. It was the first time really that Eleanor became the advocate for somebody else, and actually had made a good friend and who understood her, and it was actually a great loss for Eleanor at that school.
So when she finished at the school, she came back to the United States, and she was almost 18 in the fall of 1902, when she started seeing her cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, who she had known as a child, but started seeing him regularly at debutante parties. And so they became attracted. So what was going on between young young Franklin Roosevelt? What was the attraction?
I always thought of it as a compact of oddballs, because they were both outsiders and odd ducks in their world. One thing that's really important to understand about Franklin at that moment was that he was as in love with Theodore Roosevelt as he was with any other human being besides Franklin Roosevelt. And I'm kidding around just to say his hero was Eleanor's uncle. And Eleanor's uncle was the president of the United States, and not just the president of the United States, and who looked a little like Talmadge Boston at the moment, but he was the man of the world who people looked at Theodore Roosevelt and said, that is something new, not just in politics, not just in the American presidency, but in the world. And Franklin looked at Theodore, had been studying his every move. I mean, everything down to how many children Franklin and Eleanor ultimately had was shaped and modeled on Theodore Roosevelt. And so this was the niece of the president. People always think, oh, Eleanor, the sort of plain Jane, was lucky to have married this glamorous, dashing young prince from Groton and Harvard. Well, actually, it was the other way around, just socially. I mean, in fact, the newspapers didn't even know Franklin's name at the time. He was sort of called Franklin B. Roosevelt, or they always were making mistakes when his name appeared in the paper. And Eleanor was a glamorous niece of the President of the United States who had a lovely quality, and that quality was a kind of vulnerability. She had charm aplenty. She was a cousin. They were fifth cousins. She called Franklin's mother Cousin Sally. She was practically, well, she was part of the family. And her father had been Franklin's godfather. They were ultra related. They were already a matching pair in the deck of cards. They look great together, but as I mentioned, they were oddballs, and I think that really attracted them to each other. Neither had great social success with their peers, and I think it was one thing that you could see right away on a honeymoon that was otherwise very difficult in certain ways. They covered for each other when people challenged them on certain things, questions about America, about the American government. Franklin covered for Eleanor. Eleanor covered for Franklin when at the local flower show, when he was asked, how Americans prepared vegetables, and he could not answer. He hadn't prepared a vegetable in his life, and Eleanor covered quite neatly for him. They automatically began as a team, taking on each other's moments of stress or trial and smoothing them out. It's kind of lovely also to see how Franklin's attempts to shake Eleanor, she was unshakable, and it was a part of their partnership that began right away.
Now, if they had stayed a two-person team, then perhaps their relationship would have been different and better. But in fact, as she learned upon getting married, it was a three-person team with Eleanor Franklin and his mother, Sarah, who was always around. And that threesome is one of the most intriguing triangles in American history. So give your perspective on the challenge of having your mother-in-law basically in the middle of everything you were doing as a newly married.
There are two parts to it. And the first part is to see that Eleanor, who did not have a mother and had not really had a mother, needed a mother. And in a way, at the very beginning, took on Sarah as much as she had taken on Franklin as part of her great close emotional needs. She adored Sarah at the beginning, but very soon, and it was really with children, as children came along, that Eleanor became displaced entirely. And you know, the best way of thinking about this is imagine the day when your firstborn child was, you know, an infant in the crib and cried out in the night. If you were a parent, you know, if you were a parent of a newborn, you go rushing to that crib and you make sure you can do something for that child. You know, you bring along Dr. Spock or What to Expect When Expecting, or one of these books nowadays that people learn from. Those days there were no books. And Eleanor, by the time she got to that crib, when she heard her first child, Anna Roosevelt, crying out, there was already not just a maid, a nanny, a governess, a nurse taking care of the child, but Sarah had already given the orders to the nurse that castor oil should be administered, and the nurse was already taking care of the child. Eleanor was shut out as a mother, and she allowed herself to be shut out very decisively in where they would live, how they would live, what even the decorations, and even up to and including when they began living with Franklin's mother. You know, she would put a bouquet of flowers in a vase, and she'd come back in the room an hour later and the vase would have been moved, and she'd move it back to where she had placed it. And then she'd leave the room. When she came back in, strangely enough, it had been moved again. So Sarah would not let her be, would not, and Eleanor did not ever say, you know, I'm drawing the line. This is my turf. Franklin, very importantly, never challenged his mother, or very early on made clear that Eleanor and Sarah were to be the team here. And Franklin was to be consulted when needed. He had other things to do, including getting ready to run for president of the United States.
Now, Eleanor and Franklin had 6 children. During the first decade of their marriage, one child died in infancy. Give us your evaluation of Eleanor as a mother and Franklin as a father.
Franklin, as a father, had a father himself with whom he had a lovely relationship. Franklin's father was much older than he and died when Franklin was a senior in college. But he had a sense of fathering, and he had a sense of playfulness and fun, and that's what he had with his children. He gave them nicknames. He was the one they came to be tickled, and you know, there was physical affection from Franklin. There was a moment when in 1921, where 1919, where the Roosevelts were living across from Attorney General Palmer. A bomb set by an anarchist exploded. The Palmer's house was shaken. The Roosevelts' house was shaken. Windows broke, and the Roosevelts, who were coming home, rushed in through the front door. Upstairs was James Roosevelt, their second son. Franklin dashed up the steps and gripped the boy. James said he never forgot how tightly his father held him. And, you know, James, how are you? You know, are you okay? And Eleanor, meanwhile, was downstairs taking care of business, making sure the Palmers were all right, sending someone over to the Palmers, calling for ambulance. Eleanor was always the one executively in charge in the house and of the children. She was the one who listened to their prayers at night. She was the one who did the unfun things. She was also a woman who, in her childhood, was not supposed to show anger. She was not supposed to show grief. She was not supposed to show really much emotion at all. And so her essential disciplinary tactic was to say nothing at all. And that will drive kids nuts. I mean, she would withdraw. When angry, she would withdraw. When she had something to say, she said it with silence. And we call this now passive aggression, and it was very aggressive in Eleanor's case early on in her life, before she had grown and learned how to be her better self. Her children bore the brunt of that as children, and later bore the brunt of Franklin's polio in their teenage years. And the two together gave the Roosevelt children a really tough childhood.
Yeah. Now, during the early years of their marriage, it was not blissfully happy because of the mother, Sarah, because of Eleanor's way she dealt with issues by going silent. And you say that it made them, during the early years of marriage, quote, turn outward because, quote, they could not make each other happy. Quote, they could scarcely relax with each other. So besides Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt, what was the biggest source of their disconnect?
Well, Franklin was a deceiver by nature, and Eleanor was a seeker of truth. I mean, I think at the core, that's going to always create problems where one is dedicated to truth and to getting at it, and the other is dedicated to eluding it and not being quite clear and or openly deceiving. And this came to pass, of course, by the time FDR was a assistant secretary of the Navy, and they were in Washington, in Woodrow Wilson's Washington, where they had moved in 1913. And by 1914, of course, the Great War had begun. And by 1917, 1918, America was in the war, and Franklin was fully engaged in not just saber rattling as he was in 1914, as we were still neutral, but as a very highly committed, militaristic, global reaching assistant secretary of the Navy. His life at that time was thoroughly caught up, of course, in work, but also in a young woman that he had fallen in love with, Lucy Mercer. And you can see when Eleanor discovered this affair that her husband was having with her social secretary. Lucy had come into the house as Eleanor's social secretary when she was yet pregnant again and needed more help with the duties of a political wife. Eleanor responded to the discovery in a very characteristic way, which was to feel that the world was falling away from her, to feel that she was utterly alone once again, but also to quite clearly see that there were limits to her relationship with Franklin. She offered him a divorce. He did not want a divorce. He wanted political life still. It would have probably ended his political life, or at least cast great shade over it. A Catholic, a divorced Catholic woman, a Catholic woman marrying a divorced man would not have been a happy ticket in 1920, 24, or 28 necessarily. She looked at Lucy, she looked at Franklin, she saw the reality and she accepted it. She also accepted that their partnership could be something besides what it had failed to be. And I think that's what she stayed for. She stayed with Franklin because she respected, admired, indeed loved him, but also felt strongly that there was so much between them politically and otherwise, even though she had not yet discovered politics herself, but that she could be there for him. And she wanted that, I think, more than anything.
Now, after the war, shortly after the war, August 18, 1920, the American voting population doubled with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. How did that impact Eleanor Roosevelt?
It gave her her career. She was immediately important to Franklin. She was immediately important to Franklin's advisors. As Franklin ran a campaign as vice president, he was a vice presidential nominee with James Cox in 1920. The whistle stop tour that Eleanor joined as Franklin went across the country with his small nucleus, a new team of young men as they whistle stopped in this campaign. Eleanor began to be consulted by Louis Howe, FDR's advisor since his days in Albany as a state senator. Eleanor had never liked Louis. She got on the train groaning, thinking she would have to spend any time with Louis Howe. And by the end of that trip, they were the closest of friends and advisors. He consulted her constantly on issues that would pertain to the women's vote, to this entire new part of the electorate that she could represent. It also, as time went on, and with polio, which itself is another story, but she, in creating a Roosevelt presence in New York politics on her own, had women to center her focus on. She was the head of the women's division of the Democratic Party in New York. It was organizing women, seeing that women needed advice on how to vote, who to vote for, how to even think about politics, that Eleanor could go town to town, house to house, driving her own car, being a new woman, as it was called in the 20s. It gave her a reason beyond simply the reason that Franklin's polio put a stop for a short time to his career, but it gave her raison d'etre. And I think there could have been nothing, without it, she would have had a very different trajectory.
Well, a year after the 19th Amendment passed in 1921 was when Franklin Roosevelt contracted polio and lost the use of his legs for the rest of his life. Their son, John, who was 5.5 years old at the time, later said, quote, "From then on, I had no parents." So how did Eleanor Roosevelt respond to her husband's polio?
The earliest days, which we all are aware of from Dari Shari's drama Sunrise at Campobello, when polio struck the summer of August of 1921, were a melodrama that Eleanor and Louis Howe were the heroes of. They immediately responded to the peril, the physical and also existential peril that polio brought to Franklin Roosevelt. He felt he was a man who did not go to church he went to church to show that he belonged in church. He didn't, and he prayed and worshipped in church, and he had a great faith. But he was breezy, he was light, he was a lighthearted man who loved his tribe and his place in the world. At Campobello, he felt God had literally abandoned him. He felt utterly never expecting to ever find himself in this place. He felt as if everything had come to an end and that there was nothing in the universe that could possibly be warm or kind or loving. Eleanor and Louis put hands on, literally, to see him through this very, very dark night of the soul, dark nights of the soul. And once that passed, once it was clear that he was not going to die, it was clear that he could survive, that he could recover, but the question was how much. For the next 8 years, Franklin's mission in life was to recover his body. And I think, to make a long story short, Eleanor's realization that she did not have a large role to play day to day in that recovery, but that she could play a role in becoming eyes and ears for Franklin as she strode out into the world, making speeches, traveling through New York State, organizing, that she created a context for a Roosevelt in public life, a Franklin Roosevelt, a Franklin Roosevelt team that she was the leader of, de facto leader of at that time, that created for him a context in which he could see her out there doing that and retain a great deal of, he stayed in touch with the party, he stayed in touch with the world. He himself, I think, was an example to her, without question, of perseverance and a constant, the daily struggle to recover his limbs, his legs. He never did. She saw him at these moments and could barely control herself at certain times, where he tried to crawl across the floor. The physicality of polio was something that was difficult for both of them, but changed them both. It also allowed them both to feel much more, to feel they were out of the world of their privileged peers. They were living in a sort of outside world. Franklin was on a on a houseboat in Florida for 7 years straight. He had a new wife, in effect, Missy LeHand, who was taking care of everything for him. Eleanor was in New York in politics. He was at Warm Springs with Missy. Eleanor was with her friends at Valkill. He was in Warm Springs with the woman who helped him figure out how he was going to walk once he regained control of his legs, how he could swing his hips in a sort of simulacrum of walking, not really walking, but it looked like walking, and looked enough like walking that when 1928 came around and the Houston Convention in the summertime was nearing, Eleanor wrote to Franklin and said, "I'm telling everyone you're going and that you're not using crutches, and so you'd better be ready." And she was very much the goad at that point. She was the one who connected Franklin up literally on the phone the night Al Smith needed Franklin to run for governor in New York in 1924. And that was, sorry, 1928, I beg your pardon. There was a moment where Smith couldn't find Franklin to ask him to run for governor. And it was Eleanor who put him up to it and put him on the phone, while Missy LeHand was saying, "No, you must stay in Warm Springs and continue your rehabilitation. You need another year or two to really get control." And he vaulted into New York politics more or less on Eleanor's springboard, from Eleanor's springboard, and from then on it was a straight line. There was a moment, I think, where you have to see the same Eleanor who saw that she couldn't help Franklin in recovering his legs and recovering his life after polio, was the Eleanor who then asked him, as she prepared for the White House when he was elected president, "What can I do? Can I take care of your mail?" And Franklin Roosevelt said to his wife, "No, you'll be intruding on Missy, on Missy LeHand." That was the moment where I think Eleanor realized she had to make her own way as First Lady, and that's one of the great turning points in her life.
Well, in connection with her making her own way as First Lady, your book makes it clearer than any prior biography of Eleanor Roosevelt that she was definitely bisexual. She had an intimate relationship with at least one woman while she was First Lady, Lorena Hickok. Of course, she had a relationship with her husband to have 6 children. And she had other very tight relationships with other. There's a picture of Lorena Hickok with Eleanor Roosevelt, but she had tight relationships with other women, with other men. And so this is really an important part of the story that no biographer had really gone deep on. So David, knowing what a national hero Eleanor Roosevelt is and has been, regarded as our most prominent and influential First Lady ever, did you have any concerns about telling that story?
Well, when I started, I was following on in the footsteps of a 3-volume biography by Blanche Wiesen-Cook, in which Eleanor was introduced to the world at that time as a, more or less, I'm being reductive, but a radical lesbian feminist. And there were aspects of all of that that were true. There were aspects of all of that that were unfortunate as a label. And when I began, if you went to Google search, the Google feature that tells you what the next most asked word is in a question, for instance, you type into Google, "Is George Washington?" The next most asked at this very moment might be, "Is George Washington alive?" Or "Is George Washington communist?" Whatever is on people's mind about George Washington, you'll see right then and there in Google. With Google search in 2009, "Is Eleanor Roosevelt?" the next most asked word was "gay." It was what people understood about her from Blanche Wiesen-Cook's work. And Blanche really had discovered not just that Eleanor was gay, but that she was passionate, that she had a life, that she had an inner life, that she was, before Joe Lash and earlier biographers had treated her as a woman who had not been responsive sexually, had not been someone who was interested in passion, in the intimacies of a love affair. Blanche Wiesen Cook did a service to the historiography of Eleanor by taking the letters that had been at the FDR library for a while, the letters between Lorena Hickok, the AP reporter whom Eleanor had fallen in love with on the campaign trail in 1932, and really recognizing in them a passionate love affair. She was much derided at the time, saying, people who known Eleanor and other historians saying, Mrs. Roosevelt wasn't gay. That, you know, this is something that can be read into these letters, or these are the letters. This is the way people wrote. Women wrote to each other. You know, in earlier times, and Eleanor was still writing that way. It wasn't really true. I sat down, and what I was worried about as a writer and as a historian was, you can't be in the room, but you can make a great deal. You can make out a lot from letters, and you can make out a lot from two people who are talking to each other about each other's bodies, about each other's souls, about each other's, you know, about the corner of one or the other's lips. There was so much intimacy. There was so much desire. There was so much discussion of their intimate life together. It would be impossible to ignore or to say this was not a physical relationship. It was. It's demonstrably a physical relationship, and an erotic relationship, and a incredibly educational relationship from the point of view of Eleanor, who learned how to be so many things through Lorena Hickok, including a really good. She was herself, Lorena, one of the great reporters of her age, and she taught Eleanor a great deal about reporting and about using her own opinions as ultimately a columnist, a syndicated columnist. What I felt strongly was that I saw as well that Eleanor's, especially in later life, and this was where other biographers had not really yet put down, you know, a real sounding, was that the relationship of her later life was with her doctor, a man named David Gurevich, the man that she declared in letters and you know, in diary form and others as one of the most important loves of her life. You couldn't suddenly see that here was someone who had a life as a gay woman who was now falling in love with her doctor. I think the thing that Eleanor taught me was that she was adaptable, she was flexible, but what she was someone who needed love, and she saw it wherever it came to her, and grasped for it, reached for it. Sometimes it was consummated, sometimes it was not. And she was simply somebody who craved closeness and craved intimacy, and did not put fine points or labels on it, and certainly didn't play identity politics or take as her identity some form or another of sexuality. I think she would have laughed or scoffed at that. I think that was not what identity was for her. So I felt strongly that the letters, had I not had Lorena Hickok's letters, if we did not have them, it would be very hard to understand her, but that those letters are as explicit as can be.
Well, recognizing that she was finding intimacy with other people over the course of time, nonetheless, your book makes clear that while he was governor of New York and while he was president of the United States, Eleanor and Franklin developed a working partnership where they could share their strengths, and they had an unalterable understanding of teamwork. So explain, with the separate lives from an intimacy standpoint, how this teamwork gelled between them.
Well, Franklin saw the presidency as himself as president. And by that, I mean, Hoover, his predecessor, had made the American executive, the office of the presidency, untouchable. I mean, you would have as much luck getting Hoover to take care of you or look after you as I would, you know, calling up the chairman of Verizon right now to talk about my bill. But then suddenly along comes Franklin Roosevelt and performs this miracle of humanizing the American presidency and allowing people, getting people to think and understand and believe that he cared for them, 1 to 1 to 1, that he would take care of your phone bill, that he did care about how you were going to pay your phone bill. And in that sense, his caring or his interest in taking care of each individual, taking care of the American people, and making a better, literally a better life for each person in America. This sounds like campaign rhetoric, but in Franklin's case, it was genuinely his mission. And in the depths of the Depression, it was not just his mission, but the necessity of moving the country at all. Eleanor could respond to this and had been responding to it for about 8 years, seeing in Franklin, and she herself introduced him to that side of life as a settlement house worker when they were younger people. But seeing in Franklin someone who, as governor of New York, had taken the themes of the progressive era, had taken the needs of the American worker, where health concerns were still paramount, and doing something about it. He was an action politician. She was an action politician. They matched in so many ways as they dealt with problems. They were both trial and error people. They both saw the problem, tried a method. If it didn't work, they tried again. They both had the same instincts. He also understood that he could use her to persuade people. Franklin constantly was consulting with Eleanor's team of women about issues, and Esther Lape, Marion Dickerman, Nancy Cook. He brought them all in individually or as a group constantly to discuss. They were part of his, not literally part of his brains trust, the group that went to Washington and became his cabinet, but they were constantly consulted, as she was. And she was not just a goad, but she was out front of Franklin and saying, you need to look at this issue and bring that in here. And he would say, you're absolutely right. Or he would say, I can't do that now. No one's going to let me do that. That's not, we're not ready for that. She was ahead of him on certain key issues, and he knew it. And I think he always was looking to her. And that played out all through the presidency, right down into the disastrous decision to put the Japanese Americans on the West Coast into internment camps. And it was there that when Eleanor, as the co-director of the Office of Civil Defense, he knew he could call upon her to go into those camps and negotiate and talk to people and soothe wounds and heal. I mean, first ladies are today often single issue figures. Mrs. Bush had literacy, I think it was. Mrs. Obama had diet and health. Eleanor was not a single issue first lady. She was not a single issue healer. She was a holistic healer. And she sort of saw she saw her role as a healer of all Americans. She saw herself as being the frontline worker. It was something that she had, a first responder, she had developed during the First World War in a Red Cross canteen. And it was part of her expansion of the role both of First Lady, but also of America itself, that America's job was to take care of all Americans, and the government's job was to take care of all Americans.
Now, of course, Franklin died in April of 1945, or maybe it was March or April, whenever it was. And Eleanor was a widow for 17 years until her death in November 1962. So during those 17 years, she did many things, but truly an international figure. But what do you regard as the high point of her achievements post-Franklin?
Well, Henry Kissinger said about her in the post-war years that she was not a Cold Warrior, but she understood the Cold War. And she really understood the Soviets, and she really understood that we had to be, and in order to negotiate in a two superpower world in which we still had the secret to the atomic bomb, and the Soviet Union was catching up and then became our nuclear equal, she knew that we had to define our role without looking carefully, without looking too carefully into the eyes of the Soviets. She never blinked. She was a tough negotiator. I think that she brought a kind of calmness to U.S.-Soviet relations in the UN. I think she understood that we were going to be dominated someday by China, and she brought China into negotiations in ways that even then statesmen were not doing. Churchill had predicted it, but Eleanor picked up on it. She was very instinctive and very intuitive. I see her greatest accomplishment, without question, as the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is the document that was ratified or voted in by the UN on December 10th, 1948, after Eleanor had brought together 56 nations to decide what a human being is and how we all will define that, and how we will give each other respect, how we will abide by each other's humanity, how each of us deserves these simple rights, these clear and simple rights. There is no question that what she did was close to a miracle, because if you think about that many different cultures, that many different politicians and statesmen trying to decide on almost anything, let alone all of what humanity was going to regard as the rights of people everywhere for all time, it's an almost impossible task that she pulled off, and in many ways I think created a world that saw at least its most noble or idealistic version. It was a high point in her own life. She was the descendant of signers of the Declaration. She's a descendant of the Livingstons who were involved in the Declaration of Independence. It was a sort of fulfillment of her own ideas that had been shaped by the First World War of world government, and it was certainly a fulfillment of Franklin Roosevelt's ideas for how the world could save itself from another war. We forget now, just the way we forget what an enormous figure Franklin was as a soldier of freedom, what he meant to the world. So many histories and so many television series and so forth sort of shrink the Roosevelts. They were symbols of freedom, of human striving and freedom. And I think that she, above all, with the Declaration of Human Rights, made it clear that what she stood for and was representing was the individual in the world, and the right of the individual, of each individual everywhere, to be taken seriously and to be cared for. And it was her signature, and I don't think there's anything else in her life that matches it, but it stands alone as a sort of Everest in her life.
We have a couple of minutes left, and we have a couple of questions from the audience that want to know about Eleanor's relationship with two different women, very different women. One is Alice Roosevelt, her cousin, and the other is Frances Perkins. So speak to the relationship she had with those two women.
Alice and she were born the same year, and they were both the odd ducks out in their own particular families. Elliot Roosevelt and Theodore Roosevelt were their fathers, and Anna and Eleanor were immediately cast as rivals, and they were somewhat rivalrous. They were debutante girls together. Alice, the more wild and daring of the two, always sort of chiding Eleanor about just wanting to have pillow fights instead of actually going out and kissing boys. Alice was a constant sort of needle in Eleanor's side, always sort of needling her. But Alice had genuine affection for Eleanor, and actually genuinely admired her. Eleanor was the person who always set the standard for goodness, or for doing what Theodore Roosevelt hoped his daughter would do, and therefore she was the standard that Alice was never quite coming up to. They flanked each other all their lives. They never really worked on anything together substantively, but I think that they both constantly pushed each other along. And there's a wonderful book called Hissing Cousins about their relationship that I strongly recommend. Frances Perkins and Eleanor were not as close as is often thought, because they're very alike in certain ways politically. The thing I always think about when I think of their relationship was that Eleanor, when she was First Lady of New York and in charge of the executive mansion in Albany, would have guests there constantly. And Frances Perkins, the young activist and the labor activist, just beginning to do work with Franklin Roosevelt as governor in the Roosevelt administration in New York, spent a night at the mansion where Eleanor and she stayed up all night in side-by-side brass beds, brass single beds. And Eleanor told her the whole story of her life. That was the kind of thing that Eleanor did when she felt she trusted someone or was close. And she and Frances Perkins drew close on that one particular evening where Frances Perkins listened, sort of agog to this awful childhood that Eleanor had had. And when she wrote about Eleanor later, she said it really established a relationship with them that they never rekindled, but that made them friends for the rest of their life. And she was very sympathetic to Eleanor, as Eleanor was to her.
Well, that's terrific. So I'll turn it over to Liz. Thank you, David. What a great
Thank you,
program and coverage of one of our most important American heroes.
Well, thank you both for an excellent discussion, and that was a great deep dive. So thank you. Thank you. And again, just one last time, I'd like to remind our viewers to pick up a copy of Eleanor at Interrobang Books and use code dfwworld for 10% off your entire online purchase. And to catch up on our past programs, head on over to our YouTube channel at dfwworld. And if you're not a member of the council yet, please join us. We'd love to have you more at events, and I look forward to meeting you in person. Visit dfwworld.org for more information on membership. Thank you again, gentlemen, and have a good evening.